Jay Dyer is back again to continue our discussion regarding stupid libertarianism. We had about a week ago. I thought it merited more discussion, more detail, more time, and Jay was kind enough to agree to come back on and talk about this. Hey, Jay, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Tim. Thanks.
And of course, Jay, you're the host of Jay's Analysis, the website that covers media, pop culture, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, kind of a very broad catch-all website. And if you have a paid subscription service, right?
Yeah, what I've been doing is going through Platonic dialogues, but I've gotten so busy with the recent news feed that I haven't had time to really get back to doing that. Although I do plan to. I was catching up on the next few dialogues in Plato, so those will be available soon.
But people who subscribe to your service get like full interviews and
Right. Yeah, I do full interviews and full philosophy lectures on classics and things like that. Yeah.
And before we really get into the meat of the subject tonight, or the subjects, I wanted to say that your website is kind of like the model of the new age, the potential of the internet, because when you're dealing in a situation when all the higher institutions of learning, media, publications, publishing houses, major media are more or less controlled by a handful of psychopathic elites, we have to rely on sort of freelance intellectuals and scholars like yourself.
Well, thank you.
And so,
Appreciate it.
and it's a great, yours and a few other, a handful of websites are a great service out there, and it would behoove listeners out there to cut off their cable TV, take the savings, and pick 6 or 7 websites to support monetarily, because
Yeah, I fully agree. It would be nice to have some people do that so that Jay's analysis wasn't making just a few $100s a month.
yeah,
So
like you're not funded by a farmer, you're not sponsored by a pharmaceutical company.
yeah, don't get any bailouts.
Lockheed Martin
Soros,
doesn't.
the National Endowment for Democracy, is not putting
Yeah.
any money into my work. So
And so just a few bucks a month. If everyone who kind of listened on the web who liked the stuff, had just doled out a few bucks a month, it'd be economically viable, and you could devote more time to these things.
I
And
could
provide,
do much
yeah,
more. Yeah, I could afford to going into an actual servers and having video and all kinds of stuff like that. So,
yeah,
but for right now, I just all I really have the energy to do is writing and audio. So,
yeah.
but maybe in the future,
Perhaps if they don't shut everything down.
right?
Okay, so we're talking about stupid libertarianism. We finished off, I think, talked about what is libertarianism? Is it a philosophy? Is it a political philosophy, a holistic philosophy of life? I said the way I approach libertarianism, I'm very sympathetic to some of its ideas and philosophy, is the non-aggression axiom and the idea of individual rights, and the fact that it just leaves people free to build their own lives, to engage in civil society, kind of conduct themselves in sort of to Tocqueville voluntary association way of life, and that's how we get true liberty and true progress in this world. And that's how I view it. And go on from what would you have to say to that?
Well, this is not an easy one to cover because there's so much that's going to be involved, and I don't want to ramble on for an hour straight or anything like that. But the first thing I guess I would say is that I guess some caveats have to be made first. Much of what you just said, I wouldn't disagree with. I believe that it is a good thing for there to be a rule of law. It's a good thing for there to be markets that operate organically on a local level. I agree that individuals do have rights. Where I would probably disagree with a lot of libertarians would be the origin or source of those rights ultimately. I certainly do have a high place for reason in my worldview and in my thought. And I can say that I have read a large portion of, many of the free market, classical liberal economic thinkers, from Locke to the British writers to, von Mises, Ayn Rand, pretty much, Bastiat, Henry Hazlitt, most of those writers in that tradition, as well as modern guys too, Tom Woods and all those kind of people too, Ron Paul. So I'm well familiar with the schools, and maybe more so with libertarian and free market principles than with um, Keynesianism. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm advocating anything like Keynesianism, or that I think that you can have a completely command and control economy. I think examples where we've had things like that with the Soviets did not fare very well. They had, they couldn't even produce the grain they needed after a while. So I'm certainly not advocating any historic models as the penultimate thing that we kind of need to go back to. I think a lot of times in intellectual circles, philosophical circles, people get it in their head that there's this ideal golden age at some point in the past. And if we can, just kind of go back to that, then, that'll solve everything. And that to me is really just kind of playing Dungeons and Dragons intellectually, kind of a role playing. And so, I was probably more along these lines in my 20s, in terms of free market stuff. And then I read some things that really kind of got me to question some of the foundational presuppositions of Americanism, the Enlightenment, at the same time as kind of going back and forth in terms of my theology at that time and how my theology might affect my views of the market. So, I had a lot of friends that were involved in distributism, and I knew some of the guys that used to run the Distributist Review, and I'm not saying that I advocate those principles either. I'm just saying that I do have a pretty good familiarity with most of the field in this regard. But what I read some works that opened my mind to some other possibilities, maybe even the possibilities of ways that things might be in a sense that have never been historically. So I think that that's the only hope going into the future when the present global system of whatever it is we have now, total crony control capitalism, when that doesn't work and we transition into the new age, as the Royal Society technocrats have dubbed it, where it's a neo-feudalism, from the UN Maury Strong type writers, Club of Rome writers. I don't think the neo-feudalism will ultimately work, just because both neo-feudalism in the globalist sense and much of the Marxism and Fabian socialism that undergirds it is premised on neo-Darwinian thought. And so I take a lot of issue with neo-Darwinian philosophy, and that's really what I think comes to dominate the philosophical views of the market when we get to the rise of the British imperial model out of neocolonialism, and as we mentioned before the discussion started, the British East India Company and the Dutch Royal Company and so forth. These kind of are pre-signifiers of the monopolistic capital market. And then as we get into the 20th century, Dr. Quigley, for example, wrote about finance capitalism in the late 1800s, and then monopoly capitalism that arose from that. And then now we have, whatever we have now, this this kind of monstrous hydra that's kind of the worst of all the different schools blended together, really, is I think what it is. So even though they kind of talk about it being a third way, it's not really even a third way, because it's actually, I think, the worst aspects of Marxism, which Marxism is pretty much as a whole bad, but the worst aspects of Marxism and the worst aspects of monopoly capitalism blended together into a third way, which ultimately just, again, amounts to neo-feudalism. So that's where I think we're going. But as for strictly critiquing the libertarian principles of free market economics, and this would also go for anarchic views as well, my perspective on philosophy comes out of a school it's generally titled the presuppositionalism. So what we do is we look at foundational assumptions of beliefs, and then we derive the rest of the worldview out of those foundational assumptions. So, for example, a person has religious beliefs; those are going to reflect the rest of the praxis, how he lives his life. If he doesn't have religious beliefs, there's going to be a praxis that comes out of that as well. That's not to say that religion necessarily solves every problem in life, or that I have all the answers to every single problem or issue. I don't, and I think as we get older and more mature in our thinking, we realize, how much we don't know. So we have a more accurate sense of our capabilities and our limitations. But as I was saying, some of the readers that I read that really kind of challenged me on that topic was I read Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler. And Decline of the West I have a pro and con view of it. The pros of it is that it's a very fascinating treatment of history that you're not going to see anywhere else. So it might compare to something like Toynbee or Wells in their treatments of history in terms of what kind of book or genre it is. But it's not in the same category either, because Spengler has a very wide breadth of knowledge and is able to tie ideas together in a way that most writers do not. So it's not typical history. It's also a bit fanciful and creative at times, which I think is a positive thing for the work. But Spengler gives the thesis that civilizations, and he's using this in a loose sense, that civilizations have kind of a lifespan. So they have an origin, a birth, a flourishing, a nexus period, and then, a kind of a climax period, and then they have a descent and a decay. And he posits that you can find these patterns throughout, basically 7 or so classic civilizations, from the Babylonians to the Greeks and so forth. And so he looks at everything from the architecture to their view of economics to their religion to the rise of mathematics and rationalism and so forth, and then their process of decay and why they decay. And he makes the thesis that was in many ways very prophetic for the West, I think, a long time ago. He said that the West is really on its last leg and moving towards decline. Now, Spengler, again, is also a cultural relativist, so I wouldn't advocate his cultural relativism, because I do think that there are universal objective principles that hold. But nevertheless, I think it's something to grapple with in terms of realpolitik and not having idealistic views of the past, because he sort of makes the key argument, I believe, that you can't really a civilization doesn't rebuild something that was a past world historical formation. He says it's always something new. I mean, you might have ideas that continue on. You might build on the shoulders of predecessors, standing on the shoulders of giants, as we say. But you're never going to have a resurrection of something that was actually a past historical formation. So he's very much a historicist in the sense of his philosophy of history, but I think there's a lot of wisdom there. And he also describes our age of the modern West as Faustian. And so Western man has, as Spengler characterizes it, made this sort of Faustian pact. He's not literally saying that there's necessarily a pact with the devil, but he's saying figuratively he's made a pact to sort of give away his soul for individual and technological supremacy. And Spengler makes the argument that while that loss of soul may give him, for a period, technological supremacy, what it also does is, over time, sort of give away his own heritage, tradition, and culture, the soul of a people, to other cultures that will supplant it. And so, in another work, Spengler makes the argument that the Eastern world, what he calls the brown world, Middle East to Far East, he said that they would use the technology of the white man to destroy the white man. All right, so I'm not intending this to be a racialist, and Spengler was an elitist, but not in the Nazi sense. He actually had to flee from the Nazis. So But Spangler's thesis on elitism is that there is a sort of natural hierarchy that develops in the world, and civilizations have these hierarchies too, and you have within these civilizations culture bearers, and so this would be the people that transmit the arts, the pioneers in science and so forth. These are the culture bearers, and so when a civilization is at its decaying point, these culture bearers are basically lost. And so what happens is you have the rise of some, cabal, cartel, whatever, which is where we are now, I think. So he was very accurate in that prediction. And you're seeing now, I think, the transference of the traditions of the West in their decay towards the East. And in this regard, this was something, planned by Council on Foreign Relations, Royal Society, things like that, the building up of our industry. Talked about.
Okay, sorry, cut out there. Technical difficulty. What can you say? Skype, you pay. You get what you pay for, right? So, okay, you were saying about basically the West, the decline of the West, its decay, and the East-West conflict, and how industry's been shipped to the East. That's sort of a plan that's been laid out for decades.
Right. Yeah. So, and then finishing up on Spengler's ideas, this idea of Homo economicus and civilizations being kind of superorganisms, and then coming to an end, and the idea of the West losing its technology to the East by design through its own sort of inner decay and decay of the elite or the culture bearing class and so forth. This I see kind of as the culmination, I guess, of the libertarian free market principles. I think Rene Guénon makes this argument as well in Reign of Quantity, where everything becomes quantified in a civilization where the happiness principle kind of takes over as the ultimate drive in the social sphere. So to get into finally the critique of the libertarian philosophy itself, I've always seen an intimate connection. I'm sure people would have disagreements here on this point because there are differing ideas in free market writers. But I've always seen a connection to between libertarianism and utilitarianism. And so in my philosophy courses, this came to the fore when we read through Locke and a lot of the Enlightenment era writers who would be formative for this, Adam Smith and others. And so classic liberalism gives birth to, in philosophy, the British school of utilitarianism. That's people like Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And their idea is that for the civil order, basically, essentially, the historic problem of man has been the state. And so the solution to this is to allow the market, which they view as sort of the ultimate driving force, I think, behind human activity. They might have personal views about religion, but for them, the champion charge of their philosophy was that the state needed to take on a negative role. And so, as we've mentioned in past talks, the political philosophy terms this negative liberty, where the role of the state exists simply to protect the rights of the market and individuals and so forth. And it might be allowed for civil defense, national defense, and so forth. But it needs to take a very isolationist, a very limited role. And then, of course, eventually we get more radical views of this with anarchism and so forth, that the state itself is the problem and needs to be abolished. I would say that ultimately this is still, I think, functioning on the Happy Meal principle, as I'll call it. I'm loving it. because when we read the utilitarian writers, they discuss the function of man in society as one in which the best way for man to be ruled is to basically not be ruled and to allow him to find happiness, security, so forth in terms of his natural desires. There's a problem, though, with the happiness society, and this is something that uh, Spangler, I think, aptly criticizes and sort of pokes fun at the happiness principle. So we've transitioned from an older age where, masculinity tended to be tied up in tribal ideas, and there's pros and cons to that. So I'm not idealizing anything from history. I'm just trying to get at the bottom of what's going on here. And when you transition out of that tribal sense of who you are, and you move into a supposedly rational society, right? So society is then based on an idea of reason, the so-called civilization, and especially one where economics comes to the fore as the driving force. We look at in a medieval city, the city is built around the church, right? So the cathedral is at the center of the city. And if we look at modern cities, the cathedrals, the tallest buildings are the J.P. Morgan Chase Manhattan, and so forth. The banks are the biggest cathedrals in modernity. And I think that really, that principle in architecture and city planning and development really lays out the essence of what I'm getting at here. Yeah. I'd like to read a quote from Huxley. Huxley talks about, he says, after all the revolutions, he says, in the final revolution, and he's talking about the economic revolutions of free markets and stuff too. He says, in the final revolution, there will basically be a completely happiness-based society. And he argues that this is the logical outwork of the libertarian revolution, if you will, or the Enlightenment market revolutions. He says religion will be the conscious and intelligent pursuit of man's final end, the unitive knowledge of the immanent Tao, or the Logos, or the transcendent Godhead, or Brahman. And the prevailing philosophy of life will be a kind of higher utilitarianism in which the greatest happiness principle would be secondary to the final end principle. The first question to be asked and answered in every contingency of life being, how will this thought or action contribute to, or interfere with, or achieve by me the greatest possible number of other individuals in terms of their final end? So what Huxley does, this is in the introduction, his foreword to Brave New World, he says, what we're going to do is when we transition into the society, we're not just going to be working on these older utilitarian 17th, 18th century British principles. We're going to expand these to the next level. And so he realizes that man doesn't just need financial and bodily security in terms of his social well-being that he derives perhaps from wealth or the marketplace. He actually needs spiritual security as well. And so what he's talking about here is a completely created new world religion. And that's essentially what he's getting at. If you read A Brave New World, that's what they do. They go to a big civic religion where they worship a big golden T, the year of our Ford golden Model T, and they participate in a kind of Auguste Comte sort of civic religion is really what they're doing. Now, somebody might say, well, who cares what Huxley thinks? Well, Huxley is, again, working on these principles and telling you where it's going to go. So I would agree that I disagree with where Huxley wants to take us. But I think he's illustrative for showing how the Brave New World society that he's talking about is one in which the maximalization of the pleasure principle is in full force. So you're not, in Brave New World, unlike 1984, you're not inhibited in your pleasures. In fact, those who live in the dystopia have every pleasure they want. They have all the soma they want. They don't lack food. They're not hungry. They're not in poverty. Poverty and those things like that are no longer a problem. So the foundational presupposition of the utilitarian position, which is, I believe, also essentially the same thing as the utilitarian principle, because the non-aggression principle, I don't think operates on its own. It comes in with a context as well, and you can actually sort of extend the non-aggression principle to basically be a reformulation or restatement of the happiness principle of utilitarianism. And so, again, to bring this into context if we think back to Locke and the statement about I think Jefferson actually quoted Locke word for word when he was penning the preamble. Is that, if I recall, do you recall what I'm talking about?
Life, liberty, and property, and he said pursuit
Yeah,
of
he
happiness.
changed it to pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
Correct, right. So what I see there is America as sort of the grand experiment of the Enlightenment era. And unfortunately, and again, I don't mean to be overly simplified, but America becomes the engine for the very thing that Huxley's talking about. And so I think Huxley's right when he's looking at America and history and the British empiricism and liberal tradition. And he's looking at the presuppositions that come out of the French Revolution for America with the Girondins, who are the right-wing nobility version of the revolution, as opposed to the Jacobins, who are the left-wing hardcore communist types. We can see a model for the false left-right dialectic as well as the false capitalist communist dialectic in the Jacobins and the Girondins, because they both have at root the philosophical presuppositions of liberalism, and I think that ultimately is the problem.
Yeah.
So that would be my summation criticism, and so there's all sorts of addendums that you can make to that, where you can say, well, if you want an actual syllogism, or if you want an actual argument against utilitarian principles or non-aggression principles or whatever, we can argue about how there are so many cases where you can show that not the so-called principle of not aggressing another person in itself doesn't provide you a benchmark to know whether or not it's quantitative or qualitative aggression that you have to avoid or enforce.
Yeah.
And I think you and I have talked about this, so I'm getting kind of lost in which podcast I'm on. I apologize for that, but there's an article at the Libertarian Party, I think it's the Libertarian Party site, that touches on a lot of this, and so I would I'll link that below our talk.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think you I'm not saying you necessarily agree, but I think you understand the point that I'm making here.
Yeah.
So I would, in summary, I would say that I do agree with some of the maybe older or medieval ideas of there being a spirit. So if there's a spirit of a people, then that people has the right to also express themselves in a social sense, and not just in an atomistic, individualized libertarian or anarchic sense. I think that's the danger. And so, for example, when we see people like Stefan Molyneux, I think Stefan makes a lot of great points, but it's very much tied with his atheism. And so Stefan's atheism and his libertarian anarcho principles go together, because for him, you can't posit any sort of relation that is binding beyond the individual in his what he believes to be use of reason.
Yeah.
So there's no binding sense of tribe or nation or history or culture. That has to all be tossed away, because those are all tied up ultimately with the lies of theism and the lies of collectivism, right? But I just see that as a one side of that dialectic of the one and the many, and I don't believe in the dialectics of one versus many. I mean, there can be situations in history where individuals need to take a stand because they're in the minority or they're persecuted, but I don't think that in reality that the universalization of human nature, which is what libertarianism is based on in terms of the Enlightenment sense of what human nature is, I think that ultimately that is the problem. And you can see this in writers like Locke, and this is why he believes in the tabula rasa. There's nothing there in you as a person prior to you receiving sense impressions and conditioning. And so then therefore the way to break out of this is to have your individualist awakening or whatever you want to call it. Which
Hmm.
so basically, I sort of view most of the libertarians as kind of like 17-year-olds that are like finding themselves right now. I'm not saying that there obviously there's a lot of really smart guys that are libertarians, and
Yeah.
I read a lot of libertarians. I like Peter Schiff's analyses for
Well, the economic analysis and the Austrian school, critique of central banking,
yes,
monetary
absolutely.
policy, and the importance of having some sort of basis for the monetary system and how it
And
imposes
there are
discipline on the political.
great critiques of Marxism. They're
Yeah.
great.
And also, there's also good power elite analysis among a certain segment of the libertarian. Like LouRockwell.com has some articles that I don't see in other websites. They tend to broach topics that you don't see other places, like 9/11 and
They have
Sandy Hook.
gotten a lot more
Yeah,
hardcore in the last few years, which I
I've
appreciate.
noticed that. That's one something that I noticed about a decade ago, but I'm not willing. That's part of our later discussion. Um, you mentioned you got into a lot there. Just made me think. Part of that Faustian bargain. Would you say an example of that Faustian bargain was the Manhattan Project?
But yeah, I think that's a stellar example.
Yeah, just do it because we can. Let's see what happens.
Yeah,
And
when meaning has been divested from the world, and another thinker that I like quite a bit, who writes a lot on these topics. And again, this I would not agree with everything he said, but Dr. Philip Sherrard has a lot of really really potent essays on theology, geopolitics, religion, history, Greek history, medieval history, and Dr. Sherrard has a good essay about the unification of science. And so he sees science as actually undermining nature, because it would actually serve a much better purpose and probably make a lot more progress in a real sense, if it were not based around a desacralized version or view of nature. Right? So
yes,
I don't mean to get into
that's transhumanism.
correct, and that's
Yeah.
exactly where he has a couple excellent essays where he argues about man and nature, man's view of immortality, that basically touch on this. Right? So he's not necessarily, and these are probably written in the 60s and 70s, but basically any Sherrard essay is going to be pretty stellar in my view. So he's somebody that I would definitely recommend, and his essays on these things are very very insightful too.
And
So yes, absolutely.
you've gotten into other. You've mentioned before that sort of this culminates in the assault on the aesthetic or the ideal masculine, ideal feminine, and the loss of beauty in the world, love. Like you have the skeptical spectacle of Caitlyn Jenner
Mm-hmm.
and these things, and this is sort of like the consumerism run amok. I
Yeah.
choose to be something. I can actually, and words don't mean anything anymore. Call me she, call me a her, but you're not a her. I
Yeah.
demand to be called a her.
I'm buying my vagina today.
Yeah. In California, this is a deliberative body, bicameral legislature in California, or signed by the governor of a year or so ago, that transgendered people can now go into the opposite sex bathrooms
Yes.
because they define themselves as a female. Now, do I have to get an operation to do that, or can I just be some sort of creep who wants to hang out in a girl's bathroom? Well, today I feel like I'm a woman. I want
Right.
to go.
You'll notice too, these are global plans, right? So
Yeah.
these aren't just laws that get passed in weirdo areas of California. They're passed in other countries like Sweden as well. I believe it was Sweden that also passed the gender neutral bathrooms where boys. One of those Nordic area countries passed
Hmm.
that law as well. And so yeah, the UN and UNESCO, of course, are all promoting the exact same agenda. And again, I would just say, this is Rockefeller's donated the land for the UN to be built on. And David Rockefeller is very much a student of von Hayek, and so it's
It's just no best oblige, right? They just like to give things away.
they're humanitarians like the British Empire, as we said. Yeah.
This what's funny about that is I was listening to Richard Grove's Peace Revolution podcast, like these 18-hour podcasts, and I listened over the course of 2 weeks in segments, and he was running a American Experience audio of the hagiography of the Rockefellers. these oil companies give money to American Experience PBS to write stories about to produce a biography of the Rockefellers. It's like, okay, but one thing that gets into all their so-called philanthropy
Mm-hmm.
and why they did it. You hear about the Ludlow massacre and John D. Rockefeller Jr. feeling bad about it all, and Ivy League getting into these things, and you must build a church, new religion, right? And you must give to the arts and to the sciences and the medicine, universities, and they play it off as some sort of act of philanthropy and giving back. And
Right.
no, it's getting control.
Yes, and as you pointed out, with the Reese Commission and all
Yeah,
that,
it's control.
completely showed what all was going on there. So what we start to see is that it's all kind of. Oh, by the way, the Clintons. I mean, what do we think they're doing with the Clinton Foundation?
All these foundations. It's an old strategy.
So once you get to you've been president for a while, you get out of there and you do your speaking tour, and then you start your foundation, and that's. I'm sure we'll have the Obama Foundation pretty soon.
And he's never so much as run a lemonade stand. He's a borderline billionaire now.
Oh, Clinton?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just
amazing.
I mean,
but when you know how to, how dirty politics works, I mean, that's really the.
Well, and of course, then there's rumors about him and the Rockefeller. Illegitimate son of the governor of Arkansas. There was Winthrop Rockefeller, I think, who was governor. There's rumor that he's actually the son of the Rockefeller.
Yeah, and Bill's like a sort of kind of received the blessing of the
yeah.
Even though he's not full Rockefeller, you said a bastard son, right? Somebody has son. Theory, right? So he's been given the blessing.
I guess he earned his keep by letting all those planes fly into Mena, Arkansas.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, and of course then he was able to get some cheap cocaine for himself and his brother. At the same time, that's how the Arkansas Development Corporation, that's where the money was laundered through. And it gets into all that. But that's how they operate. But what I'm getting at here is how your second part, well, as we kind of move into your second article, but about stupid libertarianism is many libertarians, when they talk about politics, and their policy proposals, they don't get into things like the power elites manipulation of the system. These good example is they'll talk something like about this gender neutral, gender weird, LGBT stuff. This isn't personal choice at work here. This is a global agenda.
Yes.
Through the schools and all these things, and the idea of the non-aggression axiom doesn't apply here because you're being assaulted. Your kids are being assaulted by these institutions that you're forced to pay for.
Right.
And one example I brought out was a good example is the issue of pornography. I interviewed E. Michael Jones recently,
mm-hmm.
and he wrote a book, Libido Dominandi, and he, I don't necessarily agree with everything he has to say, but I have to consider it. One thing because he's a great writer, and I admire his scholarship, so I have to give some, pay some respect to that. But an issue of pornography. The problem with pornography, and this isn't to say that there should be a law against it, but if you have a community where it's frowned upon, it won't be supported. So you can make pre-political moves against it and censor it appropriately through economic boycott. And this is what the Catholic Church was doing with Hollywood in the 30s to the 60s. A lot of the Catholic Church's power then was based on demographics in these cities. And so the Rockefellers, the WASP elite more or less, formed an alliance with the Jewish elite to destroy the cities.
Yes, and there are encyclicals that you can read at that time, Pius XI in the 20s, if I recall, about the dangers of the cinema. Absolutely.
And he's spot on right about that. And the movies were very dirty, then they were cleaned up. But then he makes a point is the first movie to show a topless woman, mainstream movie, was the Pawnbroker, which was also a Holocaust movie. And so if you criticized it, you were being anti-Semitic. And that's an old ploy, But he was the point here being is the problem with something like pornography is you may not choose to watch it, but from a societal standpoint, your neighbor may choose to watch it.
Well,
and you got to live next to him.
There's another great quote by Huxley where he says, and I was flipping through here. I've got it marked, but I can't find where I marked it. But he says, all of the civil libertarians and the classical patriots, he says, they've forgotten one thing. And he said that's their mistake about human nature, right? And so excuse me, the point he's making there is that and it's sort of the point of Brave New World, is that the human nature is not such that everyone has all the same capabilities and gifts and skills. And so I have done quite a bit of research on IQ and things like that, and how it relates to living, and studies on how low IQ and versus high IQ have been successful in business and so forth. And what you come to find is that IQ distribution is quite clearly connected with success, as well as living well and so forth. It's not the only determining factor, but IQ also is intimately tied up with heredity. And I see this as problematic for libertarianism, especially if you come from the perspective of thinking that everything is basically determined or decided from empirical science. Well, here's empirical science showing that there is a correlation, I think, between IQ and success. That does not mean that I agree with the mass dysgenics programs of the Rockefellers. I don't think we have the right to, or should be, basically trying to kill everybody. But it is still the case that there is a connection between IQ and these things. So that, to me, would seem to suggest that if skills, talents, abilities, and so forth are not things that you can expect or force. I don't know, maybe force is the right word. It reminds me of Lenin, like when Lenin gets mad with the proletariat for not waking up, right, to the level of great philosophical depth that all of the Marxist ideologues and demagogues have, and all of their philosophical ramblings. He gets frustrated with them, and it becomes almost more angry with the proletariat than he is with the bourgeoisie. Mm-hmm. And we see this as well in the Frankfurt School guys, who sort of take a Nietzschean turn. And so, ironically, I think there's kind of the same situation with libertarians. If we look at Reason Magazine, for example, Reason Magazine is a little bit more consistent in terms of their liberal principles, insofar as they recognize that on the presuppositions of libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism that they have, it's not consistent for them to try to say that you can't be transgender, or that you can't have gay marriage, or that you can't allow this agenda to go. You have no right to tell these billionaires or these large groups that they shouldn't be promoting and propagandizing and pushing this everywhere. You have no right to do that. They have every right to do that because it's well within their, quote, natural rights. And so I think that there's ultimately kind of a problem in the natural rights philosophy itself, going back to social contract and things like that. That's a longer protracted argument or debate or discussion that might not be appropriate at this point. But I to agree with you, ultimately, yes, the oligarch funding, corporate funding, Fortune 100 and 500 funding for all of these completely anti-human agendas is undeniable. And, I just don't see how it's not evident that this arises out of philosophical liberalism.
And the funding or the support, whether the phenomenon of feminism, gay rights, even the civil rights movement. I think you wrote an article recently, or you got into a debate on your website regarding that. How the civil rights movement was co-opted and utilized to disrupt and disrupt society, disrupt these communities in order to break them up, these homogenous neighborhoods and stuff like that, in order to sort of collectivize and nationalize, promote Americanism. In the aftermath of the Second World War, or actually during the World War, because a lot of the people who run in the U.S. government back then were very suspect of the German Americans and the Italian Americans, But I think it was.
Well, look, let's just put it like this: if there's no God, why can't I take your natural rights? Why can't I violate them? Who gives a damn?
And they'll say it's reason. Well, the goddess reason.
Well, you know what? The reason in the history of philosophy is not one thing. The reason of Hegel is not the same thing as the reason of Thomas More.
Yeah.
It's not the same reason of Aquinas. I mean, I'm not saying that there's not reason and logic that's objective. I believe there is. But what I'm saying is that is I think, a very naive approach to, again, assuming that you can universalize a principle about human nature that, well, everybody's going to operate rationally.
Yeah.
No, now, granted, most libertarians are well-thinking individuals would admit that, yes, most people are not going to think that well. But I find that, again, that sort of odd dialectic in, say, Stefan Molyneux quite a bit, where he constantly talks about high IQs and how stupid most people are, and yet believes in this universal sense of reason. And that I guess the anarcho-libertarians are the most evolved because they are not listening to their monkey brains, as he says. But again, well, there's no God, so there's no reason for me to abide by the non-aggression principle or reason. Why do I have to be reasonable?
Yeah.
Are you telling me? Are you telling me to be reasonable? That's aggressive. That's aggressive against my irrationality. I have a right to be irrational. My right to be irrational demands that I am emperor of the world, like Paul Atreides, and I want all your women, and I want you dead.
Yeah. The couple issues like where example, our previous discussion, I talked about free trade and how the United States was established as sort of the Constitution was established to create what was kind of a common market. That was the idea, and how the common market in the United States was, I guess, secured with the establishment of the ratification of the Commerce Clause in the Constitution of the United States, and that's to make commerce regular among the states, and how that was construed to create a nation when the United States was not supposed to be a nation; it was a confederation. And as soon as one section of the country possessed the physical will to keep them within the Union, that would be the North. They used that force and invaded and conquered the South, all on the basis of a common market. And the same thing happened with the European Union, where you had the common market. And they said, well, since we have to trade all together, now we have to have established rules. Everything has to be uniform. So this is how the argument of, quote, free trade is used to create this monoculture and to create a continental-wide empire, or a global empire for that matter. We see that with so-called intellectual property, right? All these international standards that are going to be enforced by these international bodies that have no accountability. So this is an application of an idea, but how it's applied politically or how it's applied in the real world, and that's the problem with these things. And so that, you have to think about what are the consequences of these ideas. Now, I don't want to lay off the feet of libertarians. So we argue for free trade, not managed trade, and all this stuff. But that's just an example. Another example is immigration. In principle, if you ask me about immigration, I have no love for political borders, nor for the politicians or the generals or soldiers that make those borders through warfare. If you look throughout history, there's nothing less sacred than political borders. They change all the time. That said, there's a difference between the ebb and flow of immigration and people moving back and forth from employment and all that, than, say, the planned mass immigration, replacement immigration that appears to be going on in Europe and in the United States. If you have NGOs doing the work of George Soros or other oligarchs that are intentionally moving in mass amounts of people to disrupt the culture, then you're not really dealing with immigration. You're dealing with a sort of I guess, demographic warfare. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and it's Sutherland, the former head of the World Trade Organization, has a famous quote where he says that we still retain the NATO guy too. He says we still retain this notion of homogeneity amongst Europeans, and he says, and it is that very thing that we must undermine.
Yeah, who is flying in hundreds of thousands of Sudanese to Sweden?
Right.
And why would they be doing that?
And the same in Italy with these constant rafts. Of course, they're turning them back, but and you'll notice in Israel they actually have been in the news for telling blacks that they have to go back.
Yeah, yeah.
So they don't want them. So and nor does Italy. And my intent is not to be racial here, but rather just to state what's a fact in the news. And obviously, it's I pity the people that are in such dire straits. And we see that in America with Hispanic Mexican population.
Well, they're a pawn in the game.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when you, again, understand that it's very easy to just go online and research who funds all of the mass immigration, and you'll find out very quickly that it's the Fortune 100, and they do it for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And that reason is the very thing that you said. It's to create a monoculture, because a monoculture can then be integrated into continental unions. And this also is why Karl Marx was for continental free trade, right? So there was
and central banking.
Yeah, exactly. Graduated income tax and so forth. And so when you read, there's debate amongst Marxists as to why he would be for this. And when you understand that Marx wasn't anti-capitalist, it's important to, which most people don't know that.
It was part of an important stage.
Yeah. Marx saw it as a stage, and he thought capitalism would, be the means by which everything would sort of collapse into, that everything would go into a big state control, which is where we're headed, which is really just a corporate state. And then in his mind, this would ultimately lead to the dissolution, abolition of the state. So Marx was in that regard libertarian, but certainly there's some truths there in the sense of the wealth does trickle up many times in our system. At least I think we live in a system that is very accurately described, because it's not a free market. It's not capitalism. I don't even know what to call it. It's Quigley talks quite a bit about cartels in the rise of the 20th century. So I think the cartel model is a good way to look at it. And there's really, pretty much just one main cartel. And, they've established the same fiat banking structure in most countries in the world. They're all tied in to the same entities, the same think tanks, the same trusts, the same, global meetings, Davos, Bilderberg, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all the same groups. So
interlocking directorates.
Exactly. Yeah. And revolving door and so forth. So, so yes, the immigration issue fits into this in that it's a technique of warfare as well. In the same way that you can, you just basically use multiculturalism as a Psy-Ops, as a kind of psychological warfare technique to create strategy of tension at home or abroad. You can import large amounts of third world or foreign populations to weaken the existing population.
And you can't have community in such environment.
Exactly.
People don't bond. They don't talk to each other. They,
Well, look at England. I mean, England. Yeah. I have friends in England, and they talk about how they don't even recognize the country that they grew up in.
Well, how did London go from over 90% native white to less than half in 40 years? That doesn't happen organically. That isn't to say that again, you can be critical of mass immigration and still not dislike the immigrant, because they're human beings.
Sure.
But they're being used as a weapon. It's sort of ethnic warfare, and that's what, you can't take a nation of 9 million, say, Swedes, and import 1 million immigrants and not have it disrupt that country.
And it's a strategy, and they know that.
Yeah.
And the media plays the role of terming it all racist, and it's all completely 100% a strategy. And you can find all these quotes too. I'm trying to remember, there was another one that was along these lines. Who was it? I mean, another NATO guy was basically saying
Clark. Was it Clark?
Well, I think there is one by Wesley Clark too. That may be what I'm thinking of.
The end of the homogenous European country.
And there's the exactly similar statement from Sutherland, who was the World Bank guy.
That's right. He's also wasn't he also a former Goldman Sachs?
Yes.
Or did you ever quit Goldman Sachs? It's like CIA, right? So you never leave it. But yeah, and that's how these bankers, they wanted to create this sort of these. You don't want a healthy, homogenous, ethnic-based country, because if you support that, you're obviously a Nazi.
That's a,
That's kind of
that's a firewall
yeah,
to globalism, and that's, I'm still trying to parse out what is real and not real in terms of Russia, but that's what's happening in Russia.
yeah. We have the sort of this Russian Renaissance with the returning birth rates among the white Russians, and
Well, and
yeah,
how many other countries don't have mass immigration?
yeah.
China, I mean, you can't.
Only white countries have white mass immigration.
Exactly,
So there's a plan there. Yeah, yeah,
and I think that there's a real sense in which Russia is definitely in the crosshairs, and at that higher level, certainly, the first Fortune 100 is very much involved in Russia, but I think there is some roadblock there that's legitimate, because they're not getting everything they want, and that's why we have Brzezinski,
yeah.
writing in Grand Chessboard that Russia is really the target.
And again, what's happening here is what hurts the West. I think it's been phrased as sort of like it's pathological altruism or pathological guilt, and no other culture is made to apologize for slavery or all of the evils that are heir to the flesh that have been practiced universally, but only the West is judged by these high standards.
Right. There have only been white slave owners.
Yeah, Arabs and Jews never did it. Africans didn't engage.
Yeah, African tribes didn't enslave one another.
Yeah.
I mean,
There's no such thing as white slavery, apparently. And,
yeah, there's no sex slaves that are white. Right?
Yeah, and so this is the thing, and it's because it doesn't fit the narrative. And again, this is another area I think where we're getting an area where there's sort of this conspiratorial, broad planning being conducted by the elite that isn't addressed by your mainline libertarians.
Let me read you a quote, and I want you to see. I mean, you'll probably know who it is, but I think the readers will be surprised when they hear who it is. Let me pull it up here. This is a great quote. I will say then that I am not, nor have I ever been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with whites. I will say in addition that there is a physical difference between the black and the white races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together in terms of social and political equality. That's Jefferson Davis. That's got to be the president of the that's Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, it's his opposite. Yeah,
Lincoln Douglas debates. Now I quote that just because of the general ignorance of that kind of stuff in terms of history that people have. So.
And again, another thing is this constant push of interracial. You had interracial marriage, which was it the former president of France who actually broached the idea of making it mandatory?
Yeah, I mean, I said that in a debate once with someone of some religious persuasion. I forget what they were, but they were basically saying that you have to now. I don't want to go too far here, because I don't. I think people
have a right to who they want to marry.
Have a right to choose who they want to be with. But what happens is, when you say, as I did in this argument, I said, well, I want, though, when I choose to procreate with a female, and it will be with a female, not in a test tube or with Caitlyn Jenner. When I find one that I'm wanting to mate with, I want her to be white. Now, do I have that right to choose that? And they actually got to the point where they were, well, yeah, of course you have that right. Okay, so I have that right, but you're telling me that it's wrong to be discriminatory, which is what this person was arguing.
Yeah.
Right? So basically, everybody can be discriminatory, except that now it starts to turn into the position of, oh, no, you can't be, and now you almost have to intermarry.
Hmm.
So it's a slippery slope where you very quickly start moving towards that totalitarian leftist, crazy leftist scheme of saying that you have to, like,
Well,
because
it's all a difference of saying, just pondering. Well, in the fullness of time, with everyone intermixing, there will be one race. Okay, you can ponder that.
there was
One mocha race. Okay, but there's a difference between doing that and saying savoring the idea of the destruction of the white race.
I saw a quote.
I mean,
I can't remember who it was from. It was just saw it in passing, but they actually said that some UN person or something said we need to create one gigantic, like mixed race, and so then everything will be the utopia because there won't be people won't will no longer have their distinctive characteristics, and so the great irony here,
yeah,
of course, is that this insane view of the left, this modern totalitarian quote left, they are actually not tolerant because if you believe that people should have the ability to determine their own destinies, you can't force people to do this kind of stuff. It's insane.
this is in the name of diversity. Everyone has to be the same.
Exactly.
Or of course that's where you get the Orwellian twist.
And they call it multiculturalism, and it's not, because it's designed to wreck every other culture.
Well, that's when they destroyed these ethnic neighborhoods that had distinct flavors, language, and these were communities. And I think it was Ian Michael Jones's book said, I'm reading his book right now, The Slaughter of Cities, about urban renewal and the social engineering that went into it and sort of the long-term Rockefeller political plan behind it. But he says the whole idea of community assumes the right to exclude.
Absolutely.
And so there's nothing wrong with having a Polish Catholic neighborhood, an Italian Catholic neighborhood, a Jewish section, a black section. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But if
it's scientifically demonstrable and has been known forever that like attracts to like.
Yes,
I mean, it's just a fact. I mean, we see it in nature. The badgers hang out with the badgers. I just saw a few minutes ago a bunch of raccoons running together.
Yeah, and so it just
should we extend this principle into nature and force the raccoons to hang out with the lions and the tigers where they might get eaten? I don't know.
Yeah, and so it's just, and of course the big problem here is the social engineering scheme, using coercion, deceit, people's tax dollars, undermining the education system, using the
fear. Everybody's afraid too. They're
Yeah.
afraid to ever have any kind of view, and it's just going crazy because just look at the transgender stuff. I mean, this has gone nuts in the last 2 years.
Something as bizarre, as strange as that, and you feel compelled to say, okay, well, that's his choice. Okay, but I can't say it's weird.
Well, why? Yeah, right. Why is it being crammed down my throat?
Yeah, that's the big thing, is that's the agenda that most people don't get, is you have these cultural media agendas that are being, the movies. Like I made a point about movies recently, saying about movies are made because they're crummy and they're full of sex because they make money. So actually it's quite opposite. It's the movies that are cleaner that are much more marketable.
Mm-hmm.
So they're taking a loss to promote a certain worldview.
Absolutely.
So that's not, obviously if you include smut in your movies, you're excluding a huge section of the market. So you'd expect otherwise, and Hollywood doesn't do that. They promote this stuff, and usually, with the trash comedies and all that, so you see an agenda in there, and all these things.
Yeah, well, look at what Jurassic Park proves your point. I don't think it's that great of a movie, but it did have, it didn't have a bunch of degeneracy in it, and it had the fussy CEO female actually kind of got humbled at the end and became feminine, and she went along with the masculine hero, and all the social justice warriors went crazy. We're saying that this was, just this horrible patriarchal movie, but it just message-wise actually had a good message. So there you go. And
I was thinking of taking my kids to see that. Is it worth?
It was monetarily successful. So
is it worth saying?
It's kind of a redo of the first one with a little bit of a genetic modification plot twist.
That's
so
safe for children?
It is. It's just it's an average film. I wouldn't say it's anything great, but it I think it proves your point that it was monetarily successful
because
it didn't have hideous messages in it.
The this, Chris, this moves into the your article you called IQ, Psy-Ops, and the Civilization of the Scam. And this made me think of a quote by Mark Twain. It's easier to fool people than it is to convince them that they've been fooled.
Yes.
What's the focus or purpose of that article? You want to explain it? Then we'll get it. Talk about it.
Well, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine a few years ago about the IQ spectrum, and we were talking about the different jobs, functions that people in these different sort of sections of the IQ curve that they have. And so, when you look at like that 115 up to say 125, 30 section, that's a lot of your lawyers, your doctors, your professional niche of the population. And I've always found it fascinating that distribution is so committed to the very system that enslaves them. And so it's very ironic, I guess it's sort of a paradox to me, that people of that level of IQ, generally, pretty intelligent in whatever their fields are, but of course they're compartmentalized. They're unable to, they're some of the most unable, especially baby boomer generation, to understand the things that we're talking about. They're unable to question what they've been raised with. They're not willing to consider the possibility of mass media using deception and so forth. So I was really wanting to just kind of explore possibilities or reasons why that might be. Why would it be that a very intelligent section of the population would be so brainwashed? And I think obviously there's a combination of factors that go into that. It's not any one thing. But what I argue in this piece is that, I talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is the idea that incapable people are also paradoxically incapable of grasping their own incapability. So they're not even aware of the lack of ability that they have, and so therefore, because of that, they greatly overestimate their abilities. And so this is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Similarly, very high IQ people sometimes greatly overestimate the abilities of others, and so that lends to this imbalance here in these two types of people. So that comes into play here, but ultimately I saw it kind of as a psychological issue of the ego in terms of the individual. So the individual is raised a certain way, and through education, media, and basically just a sense of their own security in life and things like that, they erect what Piaget called a schema, where you build up this network of beliefs from youth about society, about patriotism, whatever, mom, dad, familial relations. And I'm not advocating everything Piaget said. I just think that's an interesting idea, and there's something probably to that. And then what happens is the high-level psyops, social engineering, advertising execs, et cetera, well, they've been at this game for a long time, right? So it's Tavistock Institute. It's very much tied into corporate management structure and the psychology of corporations. And so they have it, I think, very much down to a science. And I posit from different PsyOps documents that they don't just have the old school techniques of manipulation, sleight of hand type stuff down to a science with Bernays and marketing. I'm sure we've all heard of that stuff in alternative circles.
Is that the organization man?
Who?
The organization man. The idea we were talking about, the idea of the corporate man.
Yeah, I'm just using as an example. I came across a piece that was making the connection between certain Tavistock guys that were also involved in putting forth theories of, I'm trying to think what they termed it, corporate structure theories and stuff like this. And this is basically, how is a CEO to, kind of run your scam, I guess.
Yeah.
How to mass social engineer and things like this. Anyway, but so what I posit in this is that I think it's a lot more advanced nowadays, especially with technological advances in terms of military psyops. And if we keep in mind that so much of the advances of this nature come out of the military-industrial complex, weaponization, things like that, the internet coming from the cryptographic world, we have to understand that these objects will also be utilized in psyops. And I fully recognize that some of this may be a bit speculative, and that's fine. I think it's good to engage in speculation. That's something that my site does do. We do advocate speculation because I think that analysis involves creativity as much as it does empirical evidence. So I think we have to have a balance of both there. But anyway, I think there's evidence to suggest quite clearly that frequencies are a part of manipulation. This is electromagnetic spectrum frequencies. I think that even screens can be utilized in this way too. And so I came across an older PSYOPs document that's probably fairly well known in alternative circles called "The Mind Has No Firewall." And this guy quotes several quotes a Russian computer virus guy who compares the human body to a computer. And so on this sort of mechanistic, reductionist, physicalist perspective, he posits different ways that the human body might be manipulated in the same way that a virus can be added to a hard drive. You might have a virus implanted into the human mind. Now, I don't mean this in the sense of like invasion of the body snatchers, but I'm saying a faulty reasoning process. We could picture it kind of as a virus.
And also,
but he also discusses, by the way, the actual means of the transmission of the data itself as being utilized for sort of deep level psyops, even to the point of flicker rates and things like that. So, we've heard conspiracy circles talk about this for a long time, but you can actually find I've done this. You can dig up the research papers from Bastrop, Texas, where they have the monkey labs, and they actually do the flicker rate testing to see what puts people in the most suggestible state. That's all true. That's not the conspiracy legend. And I think that the HD TVs are involved in that. So basically, I just extrapolate from this and from other PSYOP documents that what's going on here is that the previous generation baby boomers, and then I guess I'm a Gen Xer, and then millennials, we're all sort of being subjected to higher and higher levels of these very advanced, deep psyops, and they can be done in very, very different forms. So we're all kind of in a test tube, really. And I think that IQ group of the professionals, I posit, is just been subjected to, especially baby boomers, to very, very hardcore brainwashing and just intense propaganda for so long that they're so used to Ted Koppel and who are all the other 80s news guys that are sitting up there like your father telling you,
Peter Jennings,
all those guys. They were so tied to that they're pretty much, I think Alan Watt calls it perfectly conditioned.
Yeah, he talked about how in Britain there was a program with the United States government and the British government to ship over in the late 50s older TV sets. And it was intended to change British society, because prior to TV sets, people would meet in the park and talk. Entertainment was a public thing. And with TVs, almost within months, the parks are empty, and you can walk down the street and see the blue light in the window, and people sitting alone watching the TV set.
Right.
No longer talking. I was talking about sort of this mind control or social engineering or manipulation, mental manipulation. I guess it could just be sensory overload, and you see that with the
news part. Yeah.
Well, even today, you watch the news stories where they'll be talking about one thing and there's 3 or 4 different stories flickering underneath, and you can't concentrate on one thing. I
Or
think,
the Facebook feed itself, just this infinite
yeah,
scrolling feed of just nonstop info.
I think even Jon Stewart made a joke about one time about CNN. They actually promoted more stories per hour.
Well, this Russian tech psyop guy that is quoted in the "Mine Has No Firewall" piece, it says Solantsev also examined the problem of information noise, which creates a dense shield between a person and external reality.
Yeah,
This noise may manifest itself in the forms of signals, messages, images, or other items of information. The main target of this noise would be the consciousness of a person or a group of people.
yeah.
So this same message virus can actually sort of be put out there in the form of the fake, say, the fake news story itself,
Yeah,
or just the overload of news itself.
yeah, because you can only handle so much.
Right.
And Neil Sanders, in his book "Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own," points out this is even used in terms of marketing. And marketing ideas, marketing politics, or policies are pretty much the same thing. Um, but he says the shopping malls, the music is designed to make people aimlessly roam around and become zombies. And the malls, the parking lots are made, are constructed to confuse people. So they don't
Yes.
want to go after their car.
I've heard people do a similar analysis of big supermarkets where
Yeah.
it's essentially the same idea, where you walk into this synthetic world where everything and more than you could ever think of is like at your reach.
Yeah. Um, but
And you have to walk past all this crap to get, say, just a thing of milk. You can't just get the milk up
get
front.
the milk, yeah. But you talk about, scientists, doctors, lawyers, professionals. These are people that have, so we say, they've arrived, they made it in the system,
Right.
and so they have a lot of emotion, time, money invested within that system. So
Yes.
it's much more difficult for them to,
That's that sense of security.
yeah,
So I think the system appeals to that, to the ego is what I
mm,
write quite a bit about. And so it's very destabilizing for the psyche to consider the possibility, that you've been wrong for a long time, and most people aren't willing to do that. Uh, it reminds me too of in Brave New World. And I mentioned this in another talk, but it's very fascinating that each section, because the population is divided into these different castes that are artificial, because everybody's brought out of a test tube. So there's the alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons, and sort of alphas are kind of supposed to be the top of the chain, so they think. But each of those classes, and they wear color coded outfits. Each of those classes thinks that they're really special in some way. So the alphas actually have, and this is briefly hinted at in the book, they actually have social engineering targeted for them, right? And they don't realize that there's the world controller guy who's above them.
yeah,
Well, I mean, they realize, but the great irony is, of course, that he actually knows what's going on.
hmm
And he knows that each of those sections, even those who think that they're at the top of the pyramid, actually have a very sophisticated form of propaganda for them as well. So, yeah, and I think that's what's, when you look at Bilderberg, you're looking at that class, that section of the social strata that believes that, they're sort of the gods of the planet. But in many ways, I think that they're propagandized as well. I mean, in fact, there was even a Brookings Institute lecture. I couldn't believe this. It was a couple of years ago. There was a Brookings Institute lecture by Rydell, I think was his name. And he was telling all these top CEOs what a false flag was. So these are like, 40, 50-year-old professionals, multimillionaires, and they're just now hearing about what a
they
false flag is.
don't know. I get that impression when I'm talking to, you could say talking to lawyers, or
Yes.
professionals, and people in their 50s and 60s who are now, well-to-do but retired, and they have no idea about some of these intrigues. And
4 years ago,
yeah,
I met a guy in a bar. It was an upscale bar in Nashville, and we got to talking. We ended up having like a 4 hour talk about economics, and he worked at a decently sized firm in Nashville, and he was talking about going out of being a professional tennis player into basically managing portfolios for older wealthy clients. And he's talking about where to invest and all this stuff. And so I started talking to him about rigged markets. And this again, this was about 4 or 5 years ago. And I said, well, you know that actually the entire market itself is rigged. Well, this guy just got the biggest laugh out of that. And he was just, oh, okay. Yeah, what you don't know what you're talking about. Who are you, you little dummy? And sure enough, as we saw in the last couple of weeks, what was it? $5.6 billion fine for mass market rigging. J.P. Morgan, right?
But they ain't made 100 billion.
No, I'm not saying that fine was actually legit. They're paying it back to themselves, basically.
Yeah,
that they own. But what I'm saying is that here's even now mainstream admission of the thing.
Yeah.
I told the very intelligent, very professional, probably multimillionaire, former tennis player, trader, and he was just laughing at me.
Yeah, because from his vantage point, it's working for him for right now, and he can't see the bigger picture. When the Fed creates $23 trillion, engages in secret transactions, these currency swaps,
mm-hmm.
and then when the Congress asks a few questions, Ben Bernanke says, "Oh, I can't get into that."
Right.
Where'd the money go? I don't know. Or you have Catherine Austin Fitts when she was over at HUD,
mm-hmm.
Uncovered like $50 billion in fraud. This was back when $1 billion was a lot of money in the late 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And she discovered that there were mortgages written out on properties that didn't exist. And this is huge fraud. Or are you familiar with Peter Bruton? Probably not. I mean, he's an obscure journalist because he's a good journalist. And he wrote a book called, I have it over here. The title, basically, it's about George Bush, the savings and loan crisis, and the mafia. Basically, it's about how the CIA, the mafia, were just raiding these savings and loans and writing each other's bad loans and covering the loans with other bad loans. And eventually, when the saving loans collapsed, it's all because eventually there's no one left to funnel, no more.
I did hear somebody's lecture on the savings and loan scam.
Yeah,
so
it's Herman K. Beebe. It's on YouTube.
Yeah, that's probably what I saw.
And I actually bothered to read the book. It's a convoluted story. It's just the type of thing you'd expect a journalist to write about and be covered. I think he wrote for the Houston Chronicle, Houston Post down there. And this was back in 1992. He wrote this book, and he couldn't get it published. It was shut down by Simon and Schuster. He got a small publisher to do it. But basically, the story is just the amount of raiding and looting and fraud. There was cocaine coming through this resort down in Florida, and Jeb Bush was picking it up, and and this involves like Carl Linder, who's owner of the Cincinnati Reds, and all these bigwigs in the corporate world were all involved in this, and the Bushes, of course, and the CIA, basically the CIA and the mafia raid these savings and loans, and just use the money. Don't pay back the loans for their black operations, for their drug deals and everything.
And that's kind of what Corzine did too. It's sort of the same scam over and over.
Mm-hmm. And nothing's done about it. And you're talking, that whole debacle I forget what the bailout was back. It was in hundreds of billions back then. That was nothing compared to what happened in 2008. But
right.
But a good example is something so big, just ignored. Even ignored, and you would expect some of the libertarians to focus on that. And it's hard to argue about monetary policy and the role of the Fed and all that's well and good, but when you have this rampant corruption being conducted, just blatant rot.
And I think it's important to understand that a lot of libertarians will say, well, the Fed is a government entity because it's under the Department of the Treasury. Well, just having the name of being under some other bureaucracy does not mean that you're not private.
Yeah. Well, I've run into a lot of resistance when you call it quasi-private, because the thing is you can't sell the stock or something, but the stocks are owned by various banks, and of course owned by probably the Queen of England. I don't know.
Yeah.
And
well, I mean, the Queen owns massive amounts of land in Canada, for example. I was just talking to a friend who was up there and was hunting, and there was all these regulations about hunting on the Queen's land and stuff.
I remember a while back I was listening to another one of the podcasts by Richard Grove about England, and the biggest narco state ever was the British Empire.
Right.
And you could say probably still is in many respects. But there's a skit on Saturday Night Live, and at the time it involved someone impersonating Henry Kissinger and the Queen of England. This is from the early '90s. Now Henry Kissinger is a mule for heroin for the Queen. And you're listening. They're making fun of. They're making fun of. Basically, it was a takeoff of Masterpiece Theater with Lyndon LaRouche, the host. Very funny. But then, back then you watch it, oh, that's funny because Lyndon LaRouche is nuts. That may well be, but he's right about that.
Yeah.
But it was hilarious because this is kind of sort of like the revelation of the method, I guess, where they expose to comedy what is true.
Yeah, Saturday Night Live has done this quite a bit.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely. So it was, and you're like, yeah, I can understand this. And what's funny about it, it's admitted, because if you read the books by Niall Ferguson, what they're joking about as being cranky and wacko, Niall Ferguson admits in his books about the ascent of money and the heroin trafficking and the establishment of these international banking,
Well, and another thing is that I think Craig Roberts has had quite a few good articles on the manipulation of the gold market, and there was even a Saturday Night Live skit about that a couple of years ago as well.
Yeah. And it's and yeah, if JP Morgan can just issue paper gold,
right,
it doesn't exist, they can drive down the gold price, which takes pressure off the dollar, which enables them to
right.
create more debt in the process, and at the same time buy up more gold. So. But that's one. The Dunning-Kruger effect I thought was interesting, because that is something. The smarter someone thinks they are, the less willing are to consider alternative views or countervailing evidence to their worldviews. But again, what you're dealing with is how to close this out is I've gotten a lot of, as I've done research on the internet, and of course it's cliche, but the internet changed a lot with information. You're able to avail yourself a lot more information than you were otherwise. Find out books that existed you didn't think existed, and things like that. Research these things. And for a longest while, I was dissuaded or told not to consider things like Gary Allen's book, which is None Dare Call Conspiracy, I think is the title.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought that as sort of like an abbreviated or poor man's version of Tragedy and Hope.
Right, it is.
It kind of was written. It was written in but a lot of people say, "Oh, don't that's just conspiracy stuff." It isn't a conspiracy. It's just bureaucracy and self-interest and corruption. There's no real plan to it.
Well, if it was just that, why is it continually the same strategy, and why is it a continuation of the very thing that was written about 100 years ago?
Yeah, exactly. And it's all conducted through the foundations, the entire medical industry, the education system. The creation of the medical industry is sort of like a cartel plan.
Yes. And I didn't learn that until a few years ago. That was a new one to me. But it's nothing is surprising anymore. And I did a piece that gets into that a little bit called "The Ghost in the Machine and Mass Mind Control." And I look at Arthur Kessler, and of course Alan Watts always talking about this on his podcast. So I thought I would actually delve into it. And sure enough, you find that it's all true. And I found the APA itself has an essay, a scholarly essay that Barbara Lusk wrote called "Building a Better Brain," and so it refers back to all this same conference that was had in San Francisco in the '60s that dealt with mind control. And this was Dr. Holger Hayden and Kessler, Dean Saunders of the San Francisco Medical School. And it's called the Control of the Mind Symposium, 1961. And who held that control, or who held that symposium? Well, the Voice of America was the one who put that on. So I apologize if I brought this up in a previous talk. I can't remember, but it ties into the medical establishment, because the medical establishment sort of exists to, if we look at the Soviets, I mean, that was kind of the way that, what they would do is classify everything that wasn't in line with the central planning. They would just classify it as mental illness.
Yes, yeah.
And that's really where they want to take things now. And that's why all this MK Ultra stuff is so dangerous, because it's not just about creating some mind control assassin. It's actually about mass social control.
Mm-hmm.
And so this APA essay discusses that very danger. Actually, they even talk about how dangerous it is for neurobiology to have the ability to basically tinker with and mess with RNA. And what they could do, what governments they discuss in this essay could do, is basically just make the whole populace retarded.
Well, I heard a comment today about Joe Atwell was on Red Ice talking about the Catcher in the Rye.
Mm-hmm.
And his idea of what's the importance of catching a rye. J.D. Salinger apparently was an OSS agent, intelligence agent, and the book's promoted to corrupt the youth because he says it's not a particularly good piece of literature in his opinion. But the messages in it, there's all types of Masonic messages in it.
Right.
And excellent talks. They got into why are they using glosophates, and
Yes.
how it promotes autism by causing the intestinal lining to be compromised. It gets into the blood and it causes neurological damage. And if they keep continuing, they're going to create a race of 68 IQ people.
Yes. And this APA piece says that all of this same tampering that you're talking about could also affect the acquisition of memory. They even say that they could tailor the RNA to where it could basically erase memory. Now, I don't mean that in a mind control assassin sense. I mean, I'm sure there's some application for that, but I'm saying we're talking about masses of populaces here in this sense, where a mass populace could be targeted in such a way as to create neurodegenerative diseases.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I want to mention is the get your view on it before I let you go tonight. I've had you a long time. One thing I came across about 5, 6, 7 years ago is when I started looking into, say, the problems with the official story of 9/11, and just asking various libertarians to address this topic, like Building 7 or the anomalous crash site at the Pentagon, and a lot of them just, while they'll look into JFK and they'll talk about Pearl Harbor and even Operation Northwoods. Even Gladio, which,
Who's that? Yeah, I had this argument with, before she got really popular, Julie, big libertarian girl. She's kind of cute. Younger Julie something. She's a big Ron Paul girl, and she's been on Fox a bunch now.
Of course, if she's cute, yeah.
What is her name? Julie something.
I think I know.
Julie Borowski or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, we had a Facebook argument about 4 years ago.
Is she the blonde? I mean, that's
No, she's a brunette with a cute little cleft chin. But we had a Facebook argument about 9/11, and we were going back and forth on this, and she was just talking about how crazy it was, and I'm saying, well, number one, you're supposed to be libertarian. You should at least be open-minded.
Yeah.
Be liberal, be libertarian in your thought process.
Yeah.
And she said, well, I don't believe in false flags. That's crazy. So I showed her some Ron Paul clips of Ron Paul talking about.
Okay. Uh-oh.
That kind of put her to.
Well, I think
she got quiet after that, but no, I don't think she could talk about that.
I think Ron Paul knows, but he was trying to run a political campaign. He didn't want to openly talk about it and make of that what you will. But I think if you're dealing with something like that, you have to address it, because there's no point in being anti-war if you don't address 9/11 truth. Mm-hmm. The response I got from one libertarian was, it is our position that it's blowback.
Right.
So it's a party line, what you're talking to me. So we're not talking about evidence, we're talking about party lines here. Yeah. You're not dealing with the evidence, you're just going to say it's your position, but deal with the evidence.
I mean, come on, basic history, false flags are old news, old strategy. This has gone on forever.
Yeah. And if you're going to say that the national security state assassinated a sitting president, and that they would contemplate things like Northwoods or set 2,000 Americans to be killed at Pearl Harbor for a geopolitical end, why is this a stretch?
Why is it?
Yeah.
It's also you can also now, it's okay to talk about funding ISIS. Rand Paul's talked about that.
Yeah.
Well, if they funded ISIS, maybe they did other things like Al Qaeda.
Well, that's provable, because that Al Qaeda just grew out of the Mujahideen, and
right.
I mean, they have to cancel checks. I mean, that was what the BCCI was all about, and all that. It's about drug running and
club, yes.
And so it's these false dialectics. They're assets. And are you familiar with Ari Ben Menashe? He wrote *Prophets of War*.
I'm not.
Well, he was a Israeli gun runner, and this is arms merchant, uh,
Mhm.
Mossad agent, and he wrote a tell-all book. And now this is his claim, and his claim that the Achille Lauro was a Mossad operation. When they flew Leon Klinghoffer over the side.
I didn't know about that.
He claims in the book, he says that basically the Mossad approached, was it Abu Nidal? This group that did that, and they were posing as Sicilian dons, and they were paid $1 million to do something awful. Now, if you think about it, what, from a political standpoint, if you're the PLO or you're an Arab group, why do that? It makes no point.
Well,
But if you're the Mossad, you're the Israelis, you profit from that.
there's a weird chapter in Victor Ostrovsky's book on Arafat too, where it's hard to figure out what exactly was going on with Arafat and
Yeah.
Reagan, Soviets and Mossad. I haven't figured out yet what
Yeah.
all was going on there, but Ostrovsky has some really fascinating details in that.
And he claims that Carlos Jackal was a Mossad asset by way of deception, I think. Now, that's his claim.
Mhm.
It's out there. You can't prove these things. These things, not like you can take.
Yeah, that's what this level stuff is very, very difficult. Like
Yeah.
I read Richard Tomlinson's biography, and I still can't figure out exactly what I think's going on with that either. So, have you ever read The Big Breach?
No.
Yeah.
It's Richard. Was he a CIA?
No, he was MI6 guy,
Six.
and he supposedly defected to Russia, and his book's been published. I forget what the company is, but he's caused a sort of a stir, leaking a whole bunch of MI6 agents to YouTube, or maybe not, may not have been YouTube, but it was somewhere online. And then when you watch Skyfall, Javier Bardem's character does that very thing. He leaks all these MI6 agents up to YouTube. So that's the first thing I thought of was Richard Thomas's book. But it's very difficult when you know about then there's double agents, triple agents, all this. It's very hard to parse out, especially because even spy biographies contain deception as well. So
that's what it was almost. There's a history, the Levant affair with Israel, and also the King David bombing was originally pinned on Arabs. So that's an old trick, And I think I recently interviewed Jan Irvin. He was talking about some of the books written about MK Ultra, how a lot of these are limited hangouts.
Yeah, I did hear your interview with Jan, and I think he's right about that. But once you've read enough of these allowed to be published books, you can kind of tell that. So I would agree with him on that. I mean, you're still going to get accurate information.
Yeah.
There's another
piece of the puzzle,
Yeah, exactly. Gordon Thomas, former MI6 guy, wrote a book, Art of Betrayal, and in that book, he says quite a bit, but that's again, an authorized publication. So,
I was regarding 9/11. I was talking to one person who has a show, and I was just offline. We were just talking on the phone because I confronted him on the issue. And he told me that when 9/11 went down, his initial reaction was, "This is the New World Order. It's an inside job. I know it. I know it. I know it." And he said, but then subsequently he came to another conclusion. And I said, "What evidence did you come across that would make you believe the official story? Because usually it's the other way around."
Right.
And he really wasn't able to say. So what? Did they produce the videotapes that were timestamped? Do we have the videotapes in the Pentagon showing the plane go into it? Do we have the videotape of the hijackers getting on board the alleged doomed aircrafts? No, we never got that. So what evidence was produced? And it's almost as if a compromise had been made, that he just had to accept the stories so he could be taken seriously. That was my impression.
Well, yeah, I don't doubt that. I mean, you're not going to, you're not going to have any success in libertarian big TV spots if you have 9/11 views that are unorthodox.
Yeah, But the irony of that is that if you just walk around and go to parties, talk to people about it, you'll find a good, I would say now probably roughly half um,
Yeah.
are, and so it's almost like whereas the media, the elite circles are simply unaware that there's been a sea change among the general population regarding that. Where I just went to a wedding we were talking about just an in-law came up and started talking about certain things and completely unaware of where I come from, started talking about things. And this guy's got a real job, he's got a house and two cars, and he was talking about the pharmaceutical companies and how they link back to IG Farben and all this stuff and 9/11 and all this stuff. And and the 3 or 4 people around us were kind of, they didn't say we were nuts. They were like, oh yeah. So more people than I think than the media and some of these people are willing to admit there are open to the are aware of the issues, the problems with the official story, than you're letting on.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. But I think that the establishment did very well in sort of diffusing the 9/11 truth movement in the latter part of the last decade. So I don't know how. I mean, it seems to be doing well online.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know how well that's going to, what exactly that's going to produce, if anything. But,
yeah, as far as politics or policy.
Right. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, I said I was going to let you go.
Okay.
So, anything else to say? Any other observations?
Oh yeah, I did have a question. In your opinion, I came up when I was reading Espelin's Shadow Masters. He presented some interesting arguments about the possibility of micro-nuclear usage at 9/11.
I've heard that, yeah.
I'm just wondering what your opinion on how 9/11 went down, if you have any view on that.
Well, the only one sure thing I can say about 9/11 is what we were told happened didn't happen.
Sure, I agree with that.
Okay. Now, as far as I'm familiar with the debate regarding some of because the dynamics of the impacts are so strange, and
Right.
I don't know what to make of that. Are we dealing with video fakery? I saw it on television like most people, so that's always a possibility. It's not crazy to entertain such things, considering what we saw in the past with CNN pulling off fake missile attacks. As far as the collapse of the buildings, I've read Judy Wood's work on that, and they do seem to disintegrate. There is a disintegration process going on there. What I suspect might have been at play. There's some sort of occulted or secret technology.
I was going to say some sort of exotic weaponry. I think
Yeah.
is plausible.
Jim Fetzer is big on micro nukes.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with that is, wouldn't there be, radioactivity?
Radiation, yeah.
Now that's assuming that they haven't developed some other. Remember,
Well, that's what I was going to say is that there could be, say the way that a neutron bomb, for example, is supposed to only kill life and not destroy infrastructure.
Is there something that can disassemble matter?
Right.
And that's what Judy Wood. I watched the videotape, this high quality videotape where the spire simply disintegrates.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm watching a videotape. I'm not seeing it happen before my eyes, so I'm trusting the videotape.
Right. Well, and there are videos of people using directed energy to do stuff like that. How real those videos are, I don't know, but
and
I mean, it's certainly plausible, and
well, it certainly wasn't brought down by jet fuel. That's laughable.
Exactly.
Or impact is the plane goes in and just is absorbed by this building. Mm-hmm. And it just doesn't seem right. And at the time, I guess I was traumatized. I didn't really think about it. The whole not a brother thing, where they happen to be at the right place at the right time. What are the odds of that?
Well, and I think there's all kinds of questionable things like this, especially anything with mass media. North Korea, I think, is a funny one that nobody ever talks about. So
I'm open. But I do think that people.
I don't mean by that. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say. I'm not saying like North Korea was involved in 9/11. I'm saying there's all kinds of weird staged Photoshop stuff.
Yeah.
North Korea that nobody ever talks about. I don't know
Yeah,
why.
you know. But the what are you talking about as far as the like the dear leader showing up and
Well, for example, we hear right about what was it, March, April, May, right around that time every year, we get this story about North Korea's nukes. It comes up,
oh yeah okay
the
yeah
nuke threat comes up in the news, and last year or 2 years ago, when it was the yearly topic in the news, there was this huge AP Reuters push for the space program that the North Koreans supposedly developed. And I wrote a piece on this and I put it out. The only other publication I saw that was calling out, obviously, photoshopped pictures of North Korea was the Atlantic.
hmm
Now, the Atlantic has at times, oddly enough, linked to Kryptone for things like this because Kryptone released what were supposed to be pictures of the exact replica of the Bin Laden so-called compound in North Carolina. Um, Now, make of that what you will, but uh, I found it interesting that the supposed space program that AP, who only had that year set up an office in Pyongyang, was allowed into the new North Korean space program that was about to nuke the West. And the pictures are not of a space program, they are laughable. So you make of that what you will, but I would suggest that it calls into question. I don't know how far to go with this questioning of North Korea. Obviously, I've never been there. I've seen
oh
conflict.
it could be there. It's like a the whole country's a prop.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, I mean it does serve a certain purpose. It always has from
It does in
from
the
the Korean
media,
War.
right?
Yeah,
As a menacing threat. The North Koreans are going to get us, and then this ridiculous movie with Seth Rogen and James
yeah.
Franco comes out, the interview, and that's all tied into it. And we're supposed to believe that the Unit 138, all these, they don't even have. I mean, you look at all these pictures from North Korea; they're supposed to be high tech, whatever from the AP, and they're using like 1950s technology.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm telling you that whatever that is, it's not. It looks like a set. It's not a space program. And I don't understand. Nobody else has pointed this out. I don't know. I mean, am I nuts or am I asking the right questions here? Is what I'm trying to say. Maybe I'm completely crazy, and a space program actually does look like a B movie set or a sound studio because that's what
It-
pictures look like.
they don't really have to make an effort anymore,
Exactly.
and they get a kick out of
I know that they have to. They have to.
hey,
Like that
let's put this out and let's get people talking on the
Bin
internet.
Laden's reading list. That was hilarious.
Oh yeah, I was like, oh, hey, he borrowed my library.
It's all the like the classics of conspiracy, right?
Yeah, and it was there's Brandon Toberville made a point. He said, if he was really behind 9/11, why would he be reading David Ray Griffin?
Exactly.
You know, it's like, but then it's like then people are gonna say like, well, you got David Ray Griffin on the shelf. You're like Bin Laden. You're a terrorist, and that's
Exactly.
how the Americans are trained to think. Most Americans, or many
And the
Americans.
Psy-Op guys, I'm sure, had a hearty belly laugh over that one.
Yeah, yeah, and so it's just one of those, but I don't know, yeah. Again, we're living in a really, it's almost like we're living in an amusement park at Disneyland, and
We live in a B movie.
yeah,
Have
and
you seen those? You've got to see these if you've not seen them. The North Korean space program
no,
pictures.
actually, send me a link to it. That'd be funny.
Oh, I will. They're hilarious.
Yeah.
They're like
Well, the whole idea of North Korea being a threat. I mean, from the
right.
get-go, it wasn't. They were set up after World War II to serve that purpose. You heard Fletcher Prouty said about that. How he claimed he was after World War II and after they dropped the bomb, they weren't going to invade Japan. All the armaments that were shipped over there in anticipation of the invasion were divided up between North Vietnam and North Korea.
Is that in Secret Team?
It's in Secret Team, yeah. In several interviews
I
too. He
remember
talks
that.
about.
Yeah.
And another example I want to bring up, as far as we were talking about immigration and destabilization, and they wouldn't do this. Well, they've done this in other countries, and Fletcher Prouty talks about how the the CIA transported 1 million Tonkinese to the South to destabilize the South, gave them no means of support, water, food, and anything. Just dropped them in the South, in the rural South, and it was from that the Viet Cong threat was developed. And all that instability was interpreted as a communist insurgency, which became a justification for further U.S. involvement in the area. So there's an example of
Well, that makes sense. I had not heard that, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, you're destabilizing a region just by flooding with people, not giving them any means of support. And that was done to destabilize the South to justify further, at that time, sending in more advisors. This was done in the 50s, right after the 54 Paris Peace Accords and all that. But
oh, yeah, okay.
So, I mean, that's an example of them just playing with people's lives. And I think the hubris of Americans is they think that the same people that did this to Southeast Asia or Africa or the Middle East aren't going to do the same thing here.
Right.
And we shouldn't be so presumptuous about that. We're cattle too. So.
Exactly.
Well, Jay, listen, great. I want to thank you for coming on again tonight, spending a lot of time with me. It's always a blast talking about these things, and
I always learn from you. So
and I from you, and that's how it's supposed to be, I guess. But again, it's jaysanalysis.com. You can go there, click on the tab, and you can actually support his work.
Thank you.
And I'll be posting this soon, and you're certainly free to post it however you want. I'm going to, with the technical difficulties, I'll be combining the two parts.
Okay, good.
Take care of that. But anyway, listen, thanks again, and we'll talk soon. Again,
all right, thanks, Tim.
You'll write another article that gets the juices flowing. I want to talk to you about it. So listen, you have a good night, and we'll talk soon.